We need to move now. The situation is deteriorating fast. Understood. Lead the way.
Stay sharp, moving up. Copy, on your 6. Contact, fire!
This sector here is critical for the operation. Understood. I'll coordinate with the team immediately.
The morning fog rolled across the valley like a shroud, thick and suffocating. Emma Sullivan stood at the observation post, binoculars pressed against her eyes, scanning the horizon for movement. At 28, she had not expected to be standing here, responsible for 300 lives and a position that could determine the fate of thousands more. The radio crackled behind her. Static and silence. Communication had been unreliable for days. Emma lowered the binoculars and turned back toward the command center. The compound was a collection of reinforced structures built into the hillside, designed decades ago when this border region had been considered stable. That stability had shattered 6 weeks ago when tensions erupted into open conflict. She had been a logistics officer then, comfortable with spreadsheets and supply chains. She understood numbers, efficiency, and planning. But Colonel James Hartford had seen something else in her during the chaos of the first attacks. While others panicked, Emma had organized evacuations with calm precision. While commanders shouted orders that contradicted each other, she had quietly created a system that saved lives. 3 days ago, Hartford had been injured during a surprise assault. Before the medical transport took him away, he had gripped her hand with surprising strength. "You are ready for this," he had said, his weathered face pale but his eyes clear. "Trust yourself, Sullivan. They need someone who thinks before they act." Emma had not felt ready. She still did not. Inside the command center, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Maps covered every wall, marked with positions.
We need to move now. The
supply
situation
routes,
is deteriorating
and threat
fast.
assessments.
Understood. Lead the way.
Information changed hourly. Nothing stayed certain. Private Daniel Reed looked up from his station, his young face marked by exhaustion. He could not have been more than 20, fresh from basic training when the conflict began. Now he manned communications 16 hours a day, trying to maintain contact with headquarters through increasingly difficult conditions. "Ma'am, we received a partial transmission 10 minutes ago," Reed reported, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. "Intel suggests enemy forces are repositioning. They think an advance is coming within 48 hours. Emma moved to the central table, where a terrain model showed their position. They held a strategic pass, the only viable route for supply convoys reaching the southern territories. Losing this position would cut off aid to thousands of civilians and leave friendly forces isolated. But holding it might cost everything. "What about reinforcements?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. Reed shook his head. "Still delayed. Command says minimum 5 days, possibly 7. Resources are stretched across multiple fronts. 5 days. They might not have 5 hours if the intelligence was accurate." Emma studied the map, her mind working through scenarios. Every option carried consequences. Every choice meant risk. This was not like logistics, where problems had optimal solutions. This was war, where every solution carried a price paid in blood. Sergeant Linda Park entered the room, her uniform dusty from inspecting the perimeter defenses. Park was 15 years older than Emma, a career soldier who had served in 3 previous conflicts. Her presence
Stay
was
sharp,
steady,
moving up.
reassuring.
Copy, on your 6.
"Defenses
Contact,
are as
fire!
good as we can make them with current resources," Park reported. "But if they hit us with full force, we will need a miracle to hold more than a day." Emma nodded slowly. "Then we need to make sure we have more than a day." She turned to address the small group gathered in the command center. These were her senior staff, the people she relied on to turn decisions into action. They watched her with expressions that mixed respect with uncertainty. They were still adjusting to her leadership, still measuring whether she could carry them through what was coming. "I know this situation is difficult," Emma began, keeping her voice calm and clear. I know many of you have more experience than I do. I will not pretend to have all the answers. But I promise you this. Every decision I make will prioritize the mission and your lives equally. I will not waste either. She paused, letting her words settle. Our mission is to hold this position and protect the supply routes. We do this because people depend on us. Not just soldiers, but families, children, medical personnel, everyone trying to survive in the southern territories. If we fail, they suffer. That is not acceptable. Park nodded slightly, a gesture of approval. We have 48 hours before they move, Emma continued. We use that time to prepare. We reinforce weak points, we drill emergency procedures, and we rest in shifts. When they come, we will be ready. Reed straightened at his station, his nervousness replaced by determination. Emma spent the next hour reviewing defensive positions with Park, discussing fields of fire, fallback points, and ammunition distribution. She checked medical supplies with the base medic,
This
confirming
sector
they could
here
handle
is critical for the
casualties.
operation.
She
Understood.
walked the perimeter
I'll coordinate with the
herself,
team immediately.
speaking briefly with soldiers at each position, learning their names, seeing their faces. These were not abstract numbers on a report. They were people who had trusted the military with their lives, who had trusted her. As night fell, Emma returned to her quarters, a small room barely large enough for a cot and a desk. She sat down and opened her personal journal, the one luxury she allowed herself. Her hand hesitated over the page. What could she write that would make sense of this? What words could capture the weight settling on her shoulders? The fear she kept hidden, the determination she forced herself to feel? Finally, she wrote simply, I will not let them down. Outside, the compound settled into watchful silence. Somewhere beyond the darkness, an enemy prepared to advance. Somewhere behind them, civilians slept uneasily, hoping the supply routes would remain open. Emma closed the journal and lay back on her cot, knowing sleep would be brief and troubled. The weight of command allowed no rest. Dawn broke with the sound of distant thunder, but the sky held no clouds. Emma recognized the sound immediately. Artillery, still miles away, but moving closer. The intelligence had been wrong. They did not have 48 hours. They had minutes. She was already dressed, already moving toward the command center when the first explosion shook the ground. Dust fell from the ceiling beams as she burst through the door. Report. Emma's voice cut through the sudden chaos. Lieutenant Sofia Ramirez was already at the communications station, her dark hair pulled back tight, her fingers flying across the controls. Ramirez had served under 3 different commanders, and Emma had quickly learned to value her sharp instincts and unshakable composure. Enemy forces advancing from the northeast ridge, Ramirez called out, her voice leveled despite the urgency. Multiple units, heavier than expected. They are pushing hard toward the main supply route. Emma moved to the tactical display, her mind already processing options. The enemy had changed their approach, gambling on speed over preparation. It was bold, aggressive, and potentially devastating. Captain Robert Chun stood near the map table, his arms crossed, his expression dark. Chun was a veteran of 2 previous wars, a man who had earned his rank through decades of service. He had made his skepticism about Emma's promotion clear from the beginning, though he had never directly challenged her authority. Until now. We need to fall back, Chun said flatly. We are outnumbered and outgunned. Holding this position is suicide. Emma met his gaze. Falling back abandons the supply route. Thousands of people lose access to food, medicine, and protection. Better than losing 300 soldiers for nothing, Chun countered. This is a strategic retreat, not surrender. We regroup, wait for reinforcements, and retake the position with proper support. It was a reasonable argument. A safe argument. The kind of thinking that kept soldiers alive in the short term. But Emma saw the larger picture. How long would that take? She asked quietly. Regrouping? Waiting for reinforcements? Planning a counteroffensive? 2 weeks? 3? Chun's jaw tightened. At least that long. And in those weeks, how many civilians die without supplies? How many positions fall because we abandoned the strategic link? Emma turned back to the display. We hold. You are making a mistake, Sean said, his voice hard with frustration. You are letting emotion override tactical sense. Emma turned to face him fully. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel she had not known she possessed. I am making a command decision based on mission priorities. You are welcome to log your disagreement officially. But right now, I need you at your post, leading your unit. Can you do that, Captain? For a long moment, Sean stared at her. Something shifted in his expression, a reassessment taking place behind his eyes. Finally, he nodded once, sharply, and moved toward the door. Ramirez, get me a direct line to all unit leaders, Emma ordered. Reed, I need updated positions on enemy movements every 2 minutes. Park, prepare defensive formation delta, but keep fallback options ready. The command center exploded into controlled activity. Emma studied the tactical map, her mind racing through scenarios. The enemy was pushing toward the main route, which meant they expected resistance there. But the terrain offered another option, a narrow canyon path that most commanders would consider too risky for military movement. Most commanders. But Emma had spent weeks studying every meter of this terrain. Ramirez, I need 20 soldiers, our best climbers and marksmen, Emma said suddenly. Have them meet me at the South Armory in 5 minutes? Ramirez looked up surprised. Ma'am, we are going to give them a fight they did not expect. 15 minutes later, Emma led her small team through the canyon path. The route was treacherous, barely wide enough for single-file movement in places, with loose rocks that could betray their position with one wrong step. But it would bring them to a ridge overlooking the enemy's advance route. Private Daniel Reed had insisted on joining the team, despite Emma's hesitation. You need communications, Mom, he had said simply. I go where you go. They moved in silence, weapons ready, every sense alert. Emma's heart pounded, but her hands stayed steady. Fear was present, but it did not control her. Hartford had been right about one thing. She did think before she acted. But he had not mentioned it sometimes. Thinking clearly in crisis required pushing fear aside, not eliminating it. They reached the ridge position as the enemy column came into view below. Emma counted vehicles, estimated troop strength, and identified command units. Her small team spread along the ridge, taking positions behind natural cover. Wait for my signal, she whispered into her radio. Make every shot count. Back at the main compound, Sergeant Park had positioned defensive units exactly where Emma had specified. The enemy would expect resistance at the obvious choke points. They would not expect coordinated fire from elevated positions they had assumed were inaccessible. Emma watched through her scope as the enemy column advanced, confident and exposed. She took a slow breath. This was the moment. One decision, irreversible once made. All units, she said quietly into her radio. Execute. The ridge erupted with precision fire. Below, the enemy column broke into chaos as vehicles swerved and troops scrambled for cover. At the same moment, Park's defensive units opened fire from their positions, catching the enemy in a coordinated crossfire. It was not about overwhelming force. It was about timing, positioning, and making the enemy believe they faced a larger, more prepared opposition than they actually did. The gamble worked. Within 20 minutes. The enemy advance stalled, then began a cautious withdrawal. They had expected an easy push against a demoralized, undersupplied position. Instead, they encountered organized resistance that suggested strength. They did not want to test without better intelligence. Emma kept her team in position for another hour, ensuring the withdrawal was genuine and not a feint. Only when she was certain did she order the return to the compound. When she entered the command center, the atmosphere had changed. The tension remained, but it was mixed with something else now. Cautious respect. Chun was waiting. He stood as she entered, his expression unreadable. "That was either brilliant or insane," he said finally. "I have not decided which." Emma allowed herself a small, tired smile. Can it be both? For the first time since she had taken command, Chun smiled back. "Welcome to leadership, Commander Sullivan. It usually is both." Ramirez approached with updated reports. Enemy forces have pulled back 3 kilometers. Reconnaissance suggests they are regrouping, but not for immediate assault. We bought time. Time, the most valuable resource in war. Emma nodded, feeling exhaustion settle into her bones. But there was no time to rest. They had won a skirmish, not the battle. The enemy would return, better prepared, more cautious, and more dangerous. She looked around at the faces in the command center. Reed, exhausted, but standing tall. Park, checking weapons and preparing for the next engagement. Ramirez, already planning defensive improvements. Chun, now watching her with something approaching approval. These people had trusted her with an impossible decision. She had asked them to hold an indefensible position, to risk everything for a mission that offered no glory, only sacrifice, and they had done it, not because she had commanded them, but because she had led them. Emma returned to the map table, studying the terrain with fresh eyes. The enemy would come again. They would adapt, change tactics, probe for weaknesses. This was far from over, but for now, the supply route remained open. For now, people in the southern territories would receive aid. For now, they had held. Emma picked up her radio. "All units, this is Sullivan. Well done. Maintain positions and rotate rest shifts. We are not finished, but we proved something today. We proved that determination can match firepower, that strategy can overcome numbers, and that this position will not fall while we stand." She set down the radio and allowed herself one moment of quiet satisfaction before the next crisis demanded her attention. Outside, the sun climbed higher, indifferent to the struggles of those below. The war continued, relentless and unforgiving. But Emma Sullivan had discovered something essential about herself. She could bear the weight of command, not because she was fearless, but because she refused to let fear make her decisions. 3 weeks had passed since that first desperate stand, and Emma Sullivan had not slept more than 4 hours in any single night. The enemy had returned twice more, each time with different tactics, each time testing new approaches to break through their defenses. Each time, Emma and her soldiers had held, but the cost was mounting. The command center had become Emma's entire world. Maps covered with marks and calculations, supply reports showing dwindling resources, casualty lists that grew longer each day. Every name on those lists felt like a personal failure, even though she knew logically that losses were inevitable in war. Lieutenant Sofia Ramirez entered carrying fresh intelligence reports, her face drawn with exhaustion that matched Emma's own. They had become more than commander and subordinate over these weeks. They had become partners in an impossible task, sharing the burden of decisions that kept them both awake at night. "Headquarters finally responded," Ramirez said, setting down the decoded message. "General Patricia Moore is coming personally to assess the situation. She arrives tomorrow morning." Emma felt her stomach tighten. General Moore was a legend in the military, a woman who had risen through ranks when that path had been even more difficult than it was now. She was known for 2 things: brilliant strategic thinking and absolute, intolerance for commanders who wasted lives through poor judgment. Does she indicate what her assessment might recommend? Emma asked carefully. Ramirez hesitated. The message says she will evaluate whether continuing to hold this position justifies the ongoing cost. In other words, Emma's command decisions were being questioned at the highest levels. She might have held the position, but someone above believed she should have retreated weeks ago. Captain Robert Chun appeared in the doorway, overhearing the last exchange. Over the past weeks, his initial skepticism had transformed into grudge and respect, then into something approaching genuine support. He had saved her from a tactical error twice, and she had incorporated his experience into her planning. They had learned to work together. More is tough but fair, Chun said. If you can justify your decisions, she will listen. And if I cannot justify them? Emma asked quietly. Chun met her eyes. Then we all face the consequences together. You did not make these choices alone, Sullivan. We stood with you. That night, Emma walked the perimeter one final time before Moore's arrival. She stopped at each defensive position, speaking with soldiers who had held these posts for weeks. Their faces showed exhaustion, strain, and something else. Private Daniel Reed was still at his communications post, monitoring channels, despite being hours past his shift. He had proven invaluable, catching fragments of enemy transmissions that provided crucial intelligence. He looked up as Emma approached. Ma'am, you should rest before the general arrives, Reed said with concern. Emma smiled faintly. I could say the same to you, Private. Someone needs to keep listening, he replied simply. We have come too far to miss something important now. She placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture of gratitude she could not quite put into words, then continued her rounds. At the Eastern Observation Post, she found Sergeant Linda Park organizing supplies with meticulous care. Park had been the backbone of their defense, keeping soldiers fed, armed, and positioned effectively even when resources ran critically low. Heard the general is coming, Park said without looking up from her work. That woman has seen more combat than most generals see in 3 careers. She will understand what we accomplished here, or she will see 3 weeks of casualties that could have been avoided. Emma replied honestly. Park finally looked up, her weathered face serious. Commander, I have served under 12 different officers. Most of them made decisions to protect their careers. You made decisions to protect people who could not protect themselves. There is a difference, and Moore will see it. Emma wanted to believe that. She desperately wanted to believe that doing what she thought was right would be enough. General Patricia Moore arrived precisely at dawn, her transport escorted by fresh units that had finally broken through to reinforce the position. She was smaller than Emma had imagined, barely 5.5 feet tall, but she moved with an authority that made her seem much larger. Her silver hair was cut military short, and her eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the compound. Emma stood at attention. Her uniform as clean as she could manage given the circumstances. Her posture straight despite exhaustion. Commander Sullivan, Moore said, her voice crisp and measured. Walk me through your defensive strategy and explain why you chose to hold this position against repeated recommendations to withdraw. For the next 2 hours, Emma presented her case. She showed the strategic importance of the supply route, documented the aid that had reached southern territories because the route remained open, and demonstrated the tactical decisions that had allowed them to hold against superior numbers. Moore listened without expression, asking occasional sharp questions that cut straight to the heart of each decision. She reviewed casualty reports, examined defensive positions personally, and interviewed soldiers from multiple units. Finally, as the sun reached its peak, Moore called Emma back to the command center. Ramirez, Chun, and Park were also present. Whatever judgment was coming, It would be delivered before witnesses. Commander Sullivan, Moore began, her tone neutral. You were promoted to this position with minimal command experience during a critical phase of conflict. Many officers would have failed under such circumstances. Emma kept her expression calm, though her heart raced. Your decisions resulted in significant casualties, Moore continued. Soldiers under your command were injured and killed defending a position that could have been abandoned with minimal immediate consequences. Emma felt the weight of those words, the truth in them. People had died because of her choices. However, Moore said, and Emma heard the shift in her tone, your decisions also resulted in over 15,000 civilians receiving critical supplies that saved lives. Your tactical innovations held a strategic position against odds that our own analysts believed were insurmountable. Your leadership transformed inexperienced soldiers into an effective fighting force. Moore paused, looking directly at Emma. War demands impossible choices, Commander. The question is not whether people die under your command. The question is whether their sacrifice achieves something worth the cost. In this case, after reviewing all evidence, I believe it did. Emma felt something release in her chest, though the relief was complicated by grief for those who had not survived. You will retain your command, Moore continued. Reinforcements will allow rotation and rest for your units. But understand this, Sullivan. The easy part is over. Holding ground is one thing. Leading exhausted soldiers through the next phase of this conflict will test you in different ways. I understand, General, Emma replied quietly. Moore's expression softened slightly, just for a moment. I think you do, dismissed. As the general's transport departed later that afternoon, Emma stood at the same observation post where she had spent so many anxious hours. The valley before her looked different now, marked by the evidence of conflict, but also by the endurance of those who had defended it. Footsteps approached behind her. She turned to find a young woman in fresh uniform, clearly part of the newly arrived reinforcements. The woman could not have been more than 20, her face eager and nervous. Commander Sullivan? The young soldier asked. I am Private Anna Blake, just assigned to your unit. Emma nodded acknowledgement. Blake hesitated, then spoke quickly, as if she had been rehearsing. Ma'am, I requested assignment here specifically. I heard what you did, how you held this position when everyone said it was impossible. I wanted to serve under someone like that, someone who fights for the right reasons. Emma looked at this young soldier, seeing the idealism and hope in her eyes. It reminded her of how she had felt not so long ago, before she understood the true weight of command. Private Blake, Emma said gently, I appreciate your confidence, but understand that leadership is not about impossible victories. It is about making decisions, knowing people will suffer because of them, and living with that knowledge every day afterward. Blake's expression grew more serious, but she nodded. I understand, ma'am. That is exactly why I wanted to serve here. Because you understand that cost and still choose to stand. After Blake returned to her assigned post, Emma remained at the observation point as twilight approached. She thought about the soldiers who had not survived these weeks, whose families would receive notifications that would shatter their worlds. She thought about the civilians in southern territories, who would never know the names of those who had kept supply routes open so they could survive. She thought about the weight of command, which never grew lighter, only more familiar. Ramirez joined her as darkness fell. They stood together in comfortable silence, two women who had learned that strength was not about being unbreakable. It was about breaking, then choosing to stand anyway. You did well today, Ramirez said finally. We did well, Emma corrected. All of us. The stars emerged overhead, indifferent and eternal. Somewhere in the darkness, the war continued. New threats would emerge. New decisions would demand attention. New costs would be paid. But for now, in this moment, Emma Sullivan allowed herself to feel something she had not permitted in weeks. A cautious, complicated pride, not pride in victory. Because there was no true victory in war, not pride in having stood when standing mattered. Pride in having protected those who needed protection. Pride in having earned the trust of people who depended on her, and having honored that trust as best she could. She was not the same person who had taken command 3 weeks ago. That woman had believed leadership was about having answers. This woman understood that leadership was about finding answers while carrying doubt, making decisions while acknowledging their cost, and standing firm while feeling the full weight of responsibility. Emma Sullivan had not chosen war, but when war had demanded her service, she had given everything she could. Her legacy would not be measured in medals or promotions. It would be measured in supply routes that remained open, in civilians who survived, in soldiers who learned that courage meant standing despite fear, not standing without it. As she turned back toward the command center, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. Emma carried with her a truth that would define the rest of her service. True strength was not found in dominance or aggression. True strength was found in the willingness to sacrifice, to serve, to stand between cruelty and those who could not defend themselves. She had faced war's cruelty and had chosen compassion over callousness, protection over self-preservation, and service over safety. That choice, renewed each day despite exhaustion and doubt, was what made her not just a commander, but a leader worth following. The war would continue. More challenges awaited. More impossible decisions loomed ahead. But Emma Sullivan had discovered something essential about herself, something that would sustain her through whatever came next. She was strong enough to bear the weight. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered. And that made all the difference.